I don't know if this is working or not. It is working, thank you. And welcome to session one. This is Overcoming Impacts of Redlining and Residential Segregation. My name is Melandria King, and I serve as the managing attorney of the Memphis Fair Housing Center. We are the housing division of Memphis Area Legal Services. Memphis Area Legal Services is a proud partner with the City of Memphis. We serve as their fair housing officer. But enough about mouths. Allow me to introduce our distinguished panel today. To my immediate left, we have Ms. Rashawn Austin. And although I pulled some information from LinkedIn, I'm going to use their bios because I think this is more accurate than what I pulled from LinkedIn. So Ms. Austin is the president and CEO of the Works Incorporated. The Works Incorporated is a sponsor of an elementary charter school, runs a farmer's market and greengrocer, provides nutrition education, operates a mortgage loan fund, and does work around the comprehensive needs of children and families in our community. Ms. Austin is an outspoken and tireless advocate for the underserved in Memphis neighborhoods. She has spent her entire career developing hundreds of units of affordable housing, helping thousands of homeowners avoid foreclosure, eliminating blighted conditions, and advocating policy change for equitable practices. She earned her Master of Arts degree in urban anthropology overcome Nicole, at the University of Memphis, and her undergraduate degree at Middlebury College. She's the treasurer of the Memphis Fourth Estate, the Daily Memphian. She is also a member of the board of directors of Explore Bike Share, Neighborhood Preservation Incorporated, Building Memphis, Christian Community Foundation, Blight Authority of Memphis, and Methodist Healthcare Foundation, a very busy woman. She serves on the management committee of the Urban Land Institute Memphis chapter. I present to you Ms. Rashawn Austin. Thank you. And to Ms. Austin's immediate left, we have Mr. Morgan Williams. Mr. Williams serves as the general counsel for the National Fair Housing Alliance, and he's responsible for leading the office's strategic and tactical legal initiatives and affairs. Mr. Williams directs the National Fair Housing Alliance's efforts to pursue pioneering litigation under the Federal Fair Housing Act, often utilizing testing-based evidence and working in partnership with its network of local fair housing centers. Mr. Williams coordinates the National Fair Housing Alliance's actions to file amicus briefs and provides technical support to local fair housing centers across the country on investigation and enforcement strategies across a range of complicated and emerging topics. He also assists with the organization's federal public policy advocacy with legislative offices and federal agencies, and assists local advocates regarding state and local legislative matters. Previously, Mr. Williams was general counsel of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. He was managing fair housing enforcement in post-Katrina New Orleans and throughout Louisiana and southern Mississippi. Mr. Williams graduated with a Bachelor of Arts at Oberlin College and his Juris Doctor degree with honors from Tulane Law School. He has served on the adjunct faculty at American Law School and Loyola Law School of New Orleans. Mr. Williams received the Equal Justice Works Fellowship, the Effective Leadership Fellowship from the Terry Sanford Institute, and the Rockefeller Foundation Redevelopment Fellowship. I present to you also Mr. Morgan Williams. And at this time, I'm going to allow them to begin their presentations. I believe we're going to begin with Mr. Williams, followed by Ms. Austin. And for those of you who've just entered, if you're looking for a place to sit, we have about 2 or 3 spots available up front here. For those of you who just entered. Okay, so we just have 2. We have this one. You can join us up front here. And we have one more in the second row. Okay.
That sounds great. You want to put it on presentation mode so it's just the whole thing? Just down at the bottom, there's a little... Here, I can take care of that.
Yes, please. It's been a long time since I've used PowerPoint.
No problem.
They couldn't hear in the back?
All right, that's good to know. I'll be loud. And also, there's earphones. Earphones for anyone who can't hear in the back. Thank you all for your patience with our technical challenges and for joining us here. Again, I'm Morgan Williams. Just want to get a raise of hands of folks in the room where you're coming from. Who here works for the city of Memphis or some public agency? Yes. Great. Who here works for the city of Memphis or some public agency once again? All right. Who here works for a bank or some sort of lending institution? Okay. And then who here works for a CDC or a neighborhood group or is just a rogue ninja for the forces of good? All right. All right. This is a pretty good mix. It's a pretty good mix. Anybody else in the room who wants to say any affiliations that are important to note? All right. Well, again, I'm Morgan Williams. So with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and I'm going to talk very briefly about redlining and housing discrimination claims that are based on lending redlining assessments. And so I'll give a brief overview of that. There are some earphones being passed out if anybody is inclined. I see a hand raised, sir, for some interest. Thank you, sir, for your help with that. So I guess to advance these slides, I'll just kind of click through them. I don't know if there's a way to bring this actual computer just straight on over here.
Yes, as a matter of fact, well,
That would be great.
yeah,
Okay. That way I can just advance.
yes.
Thank you, sir. All right. So just very briefly, redlining as a definition is providing unequal access to housing, credit, or other services because of the race, color, national origin, or other prohibited characteristics of the residents in the area in which the credit seeker resides or will reside, or which the property is located. So that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about redlining. We're talking about access to housing-related services, and those services being denied for certain neighborhoods. Examples include an insurance policy that precludes homeowners insurance to flat roof homes in a city like Wilmington, Delaware, in which travelers decided that it wasn't going to provide homeowners insurance to flat roof homes. If you look at the row homes and communities of color in Wilmington, Delaware, that is a policy that serves to provide to redline that neighborhood and it has a tremendous discriminatory effect. Another example of redlining is in regards to Facebook and their ad campaigns. They allow you to select the specific geography of folks that might see your ad, and if that's in the housing market, then you're redlining those services to those specific neighborhoods. We brought a lawsuit against Travelers for their flat roof homes. We brought a lawsuit against Facebook. They're changing their platform in regards to housing, employment, and credit ads. Another example of redlining is what has been referred to more recently colloquially as reverse redlining. It's not limiting services to a neighborhood, but it's actually targeting housing services with your toxic products. And so targeting communities of color in the foreclosure crisis with predatory loans is what some lenders did. And actually the city of Memphis itself brought a lawsuit against Wells Fargo challenging those reverse redlining practices. But for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be talking about modern day redlining. I'm going to give a little bit of background and history and overview of contemporary claims. I'm going to talk a little bit about Memphis and talk about what resources are out there for investigating redlining cases. This is an overview of one frame on the problem, and Rashawn is going to talk to you about some part of the solution. So, in terms of the history of this issue, mapping inequity is a project. If you Google mapping inequity, the first thing that's going to pop up is this tremendous resource online that has local information from jurisdictions around the country and a tremendous bibliography on the history of redlining. And you can go to any city and drill down to see what their redlining maps were. So in the 1940s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation established specific maps that detailed where they would provide lending assistance to folks that were accessing their programs. And the traditional maps involved designating certain areas in which their services would be provided and certain areas that were deemed hazardous where their services would not be provided. And this is where the term redlining comes from, because what the means for developing those maps were folks in the industry got together and simply demarcated where communities of color were and marked those as hazardous. 1968, you have the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, and it throws those maps out the window. Among other things, it prohibits housing discrimination, including the making unavailable or denial of dwellings, and it makes discrimination illegal in the terms, conditions, or privileges of the provision of services or facilities with the sale or rental of dwellings. Now it says this is discriminatory, but the law doesn't go out and say how you prove certain conduct as discriminatory. It leaves that up to litigants and the courts. And modern day redlining is something that in recent years the Department of Justice and other federal regulators, as well as private litigants, have looked at as a means of challenging these historic practices of denying communities of color access to credit. So contemporary redlining claims are based on an analysis of several risk factors that are set forth in the 2009 Interagency Fair Lending Examination Procedures, as well as some of the recent cases that we've seen. And my brief presentation is not going to cover a whole lot, but what I do want to spend some time on this slide is just unpacking the importance of these risk factors, because at the core of a redlining claim and of analyzing lenders' activity in the community to assess for redlining liability are these factors: the Community Reinvestment Act assessment area, branch locations, marketing and outreach, and lending disparities. Those four primary factors are at the core of every case the DOJ has brought against a lender for a redlining violation. So the CRA assessment areas, if you're serving a metropolitan statistical area, and your CRA assessment area, which is your designated area in which you're providing your lending services, draws a horseshoe or a donut around a jurisdiction and simply doesn't include in your service area the communities of color in that MSA, then that's very ripe evidence for a potential redlining claim. Branch locations. If you map out a lender's branch locations and find that they're just in the white neighborhoods but not in the communities of color, another very strong indicator of redlining. Marketing and outreach. How does the bank advertise its services? Which publications does it advertise its services in? Which languages does it advertise its services in? Fourth, lending disparities. So looking at HMDA data, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data, to assess lending disparities. And there are a lot of tools that I'm going to outline that allow you to look at how a lender, what loan applications they receive. If they're only receiving loan applications from white applicants, why is that? And two, once an applicant walks in the door, what are the denial disparities that may be observed in how they engage a potential applicant along racial lines? Are they engaging white applicants in the same fashion that they're engaging black applicants that walk in the door? And you can look at the HMDA data to analyze answers to those two questions. And other factors that are used, notably fair housing testing, and for federal regulators, they will look and see if there are private complaints that have been raised with the bank itself or with regulators overseeing the bank. So we're going to come back to those risk factors. There's a great publication that was written out of the Center for Investigative Reporting entitled Kept Out. And it charts sort of an overview of the modern day redlining practices. And again, the practice of redlining claims has been really defined in the sorts of cases that have been recently brought. So I'm going to look at three very recent cases to just provide a little bit of overview of those risk factors and how they apply to these different cases. This is a map that obviously may look familiar to you all. It's a map of Memphis. This is a case that was settled in 2016, a large redlining case brought by the CFPB against Bancorp South, in which it was analyzed that Bancorp South was engaging in discriminatory redlining practices. And if you look at those risk factors, if you look at the CRA, so the lightly blue shaded area is actually the service area up until, I think, 2013 that Bancorp South used to define their service area. And if you notice, it wraps right around downtown Memphis. If you look at where their branches are, the pink dots, you can also notice that they wrap right around, and the red area is predominantly African American, and the lighter area is predominantly white. Similarly, CFPB, analyzed Bancorp South marketing practices and their HMDA data. And that was a case that was brought against Bancorp South and resulted in a very favorable resolution. I'm going to talk briefly about resolutions in a minute. A second case that I want to bring to your attention is out of Minnesota. This is a case, again, that was actually filed in February of 2017, a notable month given federal administration transition. It was actually litigated, and it's noteworthy because it actually, a lot of the redlining cases that we look to define sort of how redlining liability may be constructed and what banks may have to assess when they're looking at their liability is based on cases that were challenged by the DOJ but ultimately settled. And there actually haven't been very many cases that have been fully litigated. This case did go into the litigation process. And in this case, notably, the Klein Bank defendants and the bank trade associations that filed amicus briefs in support of Klein Bank noted that in order for Klein Bank to be regarded as engaged in discriminatory redlining, there needed to be some direct evidence of discrimination rather than circumstantial evidence of discrimination. The bank said, you need to find a memo that says we are discriminating against African American communities in Minneapolis because of these practices, and that's what you need in order to bring a discrimination claim. And the courts there said no. If you look at those risk factors, if you look at your CRA assessment area, if you look at your marketing practices, your branch locations, and your HMDA data, that is enough circumstantial evidence to establish discriminatory intent. And it's exactly the basis on which those risk factors are used to show that there's actual discrimination that's going on. And the third case that I just want to briefly touch on is a recent case out of Indianapolis, in the Indianapolis region. Similarly, you can see that their service area encircles in sort of a sideways horseshoe the city of Indianapolis. Their branch locations are located in predominantly white areas around the area of Memphis. In fact, until 2016, First Merchants Bank assessment area excluded 98% of majority black tracts in the Indianapolis MSA. And again, this case resulted in settlement under this administration just a few months ago. These settlement terms that are entered into in these sorts of cases involve the kinds of solutions that you would think about if you were to look at the risk factors in identifying the problem. So branch locations, all of these institutions agree to open branches in areas where they were underserved. Marketing, they all created budgets to market to urban centers. And then lending. And I'm going to turn it over to Rashawn momentarily to talk about the sorts of lending products that, you know, she's working to develop in the Memphis neighborhoods that are underserved. But all of these settlements were designed not only to change the bank's practices, but actually expand their business portfolio. Just sort of roll call wise, if you look at the top active lenders in Memphis lenders who are giving single-family loans in the region, let's say over 100 loans a year. If you look at those most active lenders and you break them into categories, there are those that are absent in communities of color, and then there are those that are present in communities of color. And so this is really blurry and hard to read. But what this shows you is the blue is the white neighborhoods of Memphis, and the green are communities of color, African-American neighborhoods in Memphis. And if you look, there are lenders who are engaged, these dots here are hard to read, but there are lenders who are engaged here with these dots in these areas providing loans among some of the most active. And then among some of the least active in communities of color, there are lenders that are providing no loans. And I put this slide up here as sort of a roll call, just to note that in Memphis, there are those that are actually able to generate lending products and services in communities of color, and there are those that are failing. If you look at those that are failing, this is those 9 lenders. The dots that have these tracks are dots where those 9 lenders, and again, these are 9 of the most active lenders in the region, where those are all lenders have no loan approvals in those tracks and no branches in those tracks. So this is 2017 loan origination data, and we can see no activity in communities of color. And if you line this map up from 2017 of today's lending practices up against the redlining maps where these provisions were explicit, you see exactly the same pattern. Everything old is new again is something that's been referred to in describing redlining claims. Maybe in some ways, Memphis itself, New Orleans, where I'm from, we say we're so far behind, we're ahead. But maybe this is a tagline for Memphis here. And so my time is limited, and I'm just going to be very brief in running through a few resources that can be used to investigate these lenders. Okay? HMDA data, depository institution location, CRA, public evaluations and files, and other resources. So I'll just run through those briefly. HMDA data, you can get it, you can chart it, and you can compare institutions to their peers. When engaging in that peer conduct analysis, federal regulators will look to activity among peers that's between 50 and 200% of the lender's volume within the market. And so what you can do is look at that lender's disparity ratios and compare them with their peers as one basis of evidence to prove redlining. Second thing you can do is find where their branches are and chart them on a map that shows you whether those branches are in white neighborhoods or black neighborhoods. You can find that information here. Third thing you can do is review their public CRA reports. This will show you their service areas and how they've changed over time and what their assertions are about those changes. And that can be very ripe evidence for bringing these sorts of claims. And finally, you can look to other resources. DOJ has a number of resources available for information about the sorts of claims that it brings. The Federal Reserve has some tremendous fair lending webinars that are a great resource for analyzing the cutting edge kind of circumstances around redlining claims. Redlining is central to what they are focused on in their regulatory oversight currently. Their 2019 Fair Housing presentation and their 2018 heavily cover redlining. And then the last tool here is with that kept out article, there's a really great tool where you can do bank-specific lending disparity searches. So if you go to this link, you can type in the name of any bank. It could be a bank that you work for, it could be a bank that you conduct business with. And you can identify, based on their 2016, I think, HMDA reporting, what their disparity ratios are, who they gave loans to on the basis of race. And that can be very powerful information in communicating with that bank. The last thing I want to say is that if you want to get involved, the National Fair Housing Alliance is based in DC. We have local member organizations all over the country, but there isn't one in Memphis. And so one of the things that we do is we partner with local communities where there are no fair housing offices to engage in fair housing testing and investigations in those communities. And so we are working with partners in Memphis to do just that now. And if you're interested in being a fair housing tester, learning more, you can email my colleague Camille at that email. But with that, I will turn it over to Rashawn to provide information about the tremendous work that she's doing.
Thank you, Morgan. Good morning. And so I am one of those partners that's been working with the National Fair Housing. But before that, I guess I want to give some context of how a community development corporation that's not a community development financial institution is a lender in residential mortgages. And so I won't take the credit for why we have a product, the Opportunity Home Loan Fund. Our professional organization for community development corporations, now Building Memphis, formerly the Community Development Council of Greater Memphis, for years. And so my entire involvement in community development for the last 24 years, we've been talking about the need for a residential home mortgage in core neighborhoods. Those red areas that you saw on that 1940s map that looks identical to the 2019 map that they don't officially draw anymore. But we know that it's still true, as Morgan just indicated. In the earlier session, the plenary session, they were talking about, several people mentioned disinvestment in core neighborhoods. And so when I talk, usually I talk about neighborhood stabilization, I go back and I use, and I'm not Jewish, so if anyone in the room is Jewish, I use the Talmud or the Torah. I found some interesting information there. In the Talmud, it says that the teacher or the rabbi should not exist in a community that doesn't have certain elements. And things like, they say bloodletter, but we're not going to talk about bloodletters because I don't want anybody letting blood in 2019. But it's so primary health care services, housing, the butcher, the baker, so food, health care, a community center. They talk about the synagogue. And so when I think about neighborhoods, those same places should exist for people today in whatever the neighborhood is, whether it's a minister, a Hindu priest, a rabbi in the Jewish tradition, or whatever tradition, and it doesn't have to be a religious tradition, but those things need to exist in all neighborhoods for all people, for them to have a great quality of life and be vibrant neighborhoods that are growing. And so just to give you some background, I worked in community development for about a decade before I was recruited away by the mortgage servicing division, GMAC, formerly GMAC Mortgage and Homecomings Financial, to do foreclosure prevention work. And so everybody thinks about the housing crisis of 2008. I was recruited in December of 2004. And so we already knew about the crisis at least 4 years before the balloon burst. And so I discovered a lot in the 9 years that I was working in mortgage servicing across the country as a broker, helping families remain in their homes, and particularly in cities that were in the Rust Belt. So you think about where the auto manufacturers are and big industry, like in the Midwest, so our neighbors to the north. And I was specifically targeting our tri-state area of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas, but got pulled away to places like Florida and California, where we were seeing the hardest hit areas. And so, more context, before in community development, as a developer of residential housing, what we were discovering was that we were investing $120,000 or so in land acquisition and development for a new construction, and we were getting a $50,000 appraisal. So, who likes to have negative money in the room? Anybody? Raise your hands. And so that's $70,000 negative. And so the CDC, with federal entitlement funds, we were subsidizing that, but the banks were unwilling to make loans at that rate, at $50,000 or lower. And so people ended up in rental situations, and they could potentially be homeowners, but we could not make a loan for greater than the appraisal. And so that was just one of the problems. And I'll go ahead and start the slide. And so I just wanted to give that background because one of our bank partners, Pinnacle Financial, approached me specifically because I had a background in being a developer trying to get people into loans on the front end, but I also saw homeowners almost losing their homes because of the type of products that they were in, starting in the 90s probably, when we expanded lending. And it was great. You know, I think everyone meant well to expand lending practices or lending opportunities to families in communities of color. As Morgan says, mostly in Memphis, African American communities. And so we saw the products like the 100% loan to value. We even saw 110% loan to value, which meant that families entered ownership in a negative position. What happened at the same time? Those neighborhoods were declining. So we were not reinvesting in those places. We were not adding to our, improving our infrastructure. We were not building new houses. You had investors flipping houses that were nice assets, brick homes for $8,000. So it was that investor to investor transfer. And the comparables meant that our appraised values were going lower and lower, so nobody was lending in those areas. And then another fact is that African Americans, given our history in this country, don't have a lot of wealth, generational wealth. And so in traditional lending, lenders had been looking for an outlay of cash prior to these 110% loan to value. And I'm anti-negative equity loans, and hopefully we don't get back into those. But even the 97% loan to value, if you entered in at a 3% down payment, the neighborhood went down, your appraisal went down, so you ended up in negative equity anyway, whether you started that way or not. And so we wanted to create a product based on my experience at doing foreclosure prevention and lending on the front end that met the needs of customers in neighborhoods like where I've worked all my life in 381, and I'll go through the zip codes, but there are those red areas on that map. And so there were some factors limiting financial institutions in lending, and I don't think Keith Turbot is in here from First Horizon. Yesterday they were First Tennessee, but First Horizon now, because I like to pick on him as my banker of choice. Somebody else said you like to pick on him too, yeah. So I'm not going to pick on my board chair at Regents. I'm just going to pick on First Horizon. But banks talk about, and a lot of it is true, with the Frank Dodd Act that happened during the 2008 crisis, they can't do certain things. And so that they look predatory if they make really small loans because their fees are the same. And if you think about a homeowner that we may approach us, if they're getting a $50,000 loan, I'm probably doing a lot more hand-holding and work than a customer who is going to a traditional lending institution and getting a $500,000 loan. Because they probably have a lot of cash, they have a great credit score, and so I'm having to spend a lot more time, or not me, Gary now, my mortgage program officer, who has a mortgage lending background from Pinnacle and First Tennessee and some other banks, probably SunTrust. Now she's doing this program for us, but when we established it, I was the underwriter, originator. I was a lot of stuff. And Gary now takes that on. But so banks really do there are some truths into why they can't lend under a certain amount for a single family residential. The small dollar loans look predatory with the fees because they still have to pay the person or people who are originating and underwriting, and they have to charge a certain interest rate, and so after a while those look like very high cost loans. And so the Works wanted to address with our Opportunity Home Loan Fund those zip codes that had been forgotten. And so those include where we're located in 3106, 126, our neighbor to the north, 38109, our southwestern neighbor, 38114, which comprises Orange Mound, Bethel Grove, and some other neighborhoods, 38107, which is Klondike Smoky City, a part of Uptown, 38108, which is Hyde Park, Hollywood, and Douglas, 38127, Frazier, and 38112, and not the people think about Binghamton, but more the Heights area, Mitchell Heights and those other Heights neighborhoods that are around the Summer corridor. And we were targeting them because what we found is that there were opportunities with homes in those neighborhoods that were appraising at $50,000 and below, but people could not obtain a mortgage from a traditional lender. And so we established something I call social underwriting versus the traditional lending. And so it's a combination of the front end work and the foreclosure prevention work. And so in foreclosure prevention, we would look at the household budget. And so I have people come in and I start asking them questions about their food costs, and people they thought they needed to be in a negative to get help, and I was always like, we can't make $1 out of 55 cents, so I need you to tell me the truth. And so if you have a family of 10 and you tell me you spent $100 on grocery, And I'm looking at you and I'm like, I think you eat. So I don't think you spend $100 on groceries. So please tell me the truth so that I can find a way to help you. And we asked them about their utility costs. We asked them about entertainment. So do you go to the movies? Tell me the truth. Do you eat out? And they say, oh, no, I don't eat out. And I say, may I see your bank statements? And they have $200 a week in Burger King charges. And I'm like, oh, so you have a Burger King at your kitchen. You do eat out. Because they were mostly thinking of sit-down restaurants, but they were stopping on the way home from picking up the kids, and they were swiping their debit card and not thinking about that, and they were spending $200 at Burger King. And so I was adding that to their budget, mostly because I was looking for ways to help them cut costs to save their homes. And so everything you could think of. Do you have a dog? Do you have a cat? Do you buy pet food? Do you have vet visits? Do your kids go on field trips at school? Do you buy uniforms? And so I looked at the entire household budget, and sometimes they ended up negative. And so we had to find ways that you don't eat at Burger King 10,000 times a week. Like, that's not your go-to. Let's cook and go to a food pantry in your town. So we would connect them with cooking education and resources for food. And if they had needed utility assistance, okay, we would connect them with programs that will provide assistance, weatherization, and so you get the point. And so I wanted to bring this to lending on the front end so that I wouldn't see people on the back end needing foreclosure prevention. And so our product looks at the traditional debt-to-income ratio that banks look at. And so we expect families to spend about a third of their income on housing costs. And so that's kind of where banks have landed. Between 29 and 33% is generally where that front end ratio or the housing ratio is. And then on the back end ratio, and I explain this to every borrower potential borrower that comes in, on the back end ratio, we kind of go on the high end of about 45%. So that's the total debt. That's the mortgage plus credit cards, so installment and revolving loans. And we also found that a lot of people in these neighborhoods did not have traditional credit because no one was lending to them. These banks were not present and would not give them credit card loans or installment loans. And so that was another reason banks would not lend, because they didn't have a credit score. So it's kind of catch-22. If you don't have loans, you don't have a good credit score. You can't get a good credit score because nobody will make you loans. Ideally, a person is left with a surplus, because I wanted to see them have at least a 10% surplus, because we have tires that are flattened or we have emergencies in our household. So I did not want to see these people in foreclosure. And so that's how we underwrite. And what's left over at the bottom is the housing payment. That's what you can afford for the house. And so we look at everything else to get to the house payment. And that's what I call social underwriting. And we don't look at a bottom FICO score, because we do not want to eliminate people who have just been paying their rent for 40 years, but they never owned. They pay their utility bill, they pay their phone bill, but they don't have a credit card. They don't have installment loans. And so we look at what we call credit behavior, not the score. So we do have some items that prevent a borrower, and we don't say no. We tell no one no. We may say not yet, but here are some steps. These are the things that you need to do. So we hold hands and we walk every individual family through their next steps. And we write them a note, so in case they forget what we said, we have bulleted points with their name on it. You need to do these things to get you to homeownership at a future date. And I'm rushing through these because I got less than 5 minutes now. I just got the sign. And so you can't come in and have judgments on your credit that are unpaid. And I tell families, because we have to do title insurance, and it's to protect the lender and the homeowner, that there are no liens that will come up. And we've had a customer I approved, and we did a title research, and she had a ring in the past that wasn't on her credit report anymore, because there are ways to get things off your credit report, but the title is unforgiving. And so it was a $10,000 debt. and I was just not going to let a jewelry company put a lien against a house. And so we needed to come to a settlement agreement, and we assist them with coming to a settlement agreement with that old creditor, a ring she no longer had, with a bad story attached to it. How do we help her come up with an agreement with that creditor to get her into this home? And so I'm going to skip some of these. We wanted to tell a story to lenders about that the people in these neighborhoods are worthy of lending to. They will repay these loans. They've been great tenants, and they paid their rental payments on time for 20 years. And so they have value, and these neighborhoods have value. And so just our performance over 24 months, and this is a little dated, this is from March of this year. And so we don't have any early payment defaults, and that was something I learned in foreclosure prevention. So that means that a loan has not experienced a 90-day delinquency. And in Tennessee, as a sheriff sales state in foreclosure, a person could fully go to foreclosure in 90 days, and literally on the courthouse steps. I didn't know that was true until I actually had to go there to the courthouse steps. And so the average loan to value is 78%, and this is one of the things I'm proudest of. So they're not entering at 110% loan to value. They're entering under 80. So what does that mean? They have net worth. They really have wealth. People talk about building wealth through home ownership for African Americans, and yes, I am guilty because I will say just about anything. Senator Warren was here, and she wanted to have I was on a housing panel with her, and so it ended up just me and her talking back and forth. And she said the statement that I almost hate to hear, that African Americans gain wealth through home ownership. And I said, so let's take that lie off the table. Because what we've seen is negative equity in African American neighborhoods, with declining neighborhoods, 110% loan to value, 97% loan to value going in, neighborhood declining, appraisals going down. We have not experienced wealth. It's negative. And so we wanted to really prove that homeowners could get in home ownership and have wealth. So they have net worth. They have more assets than they have debt. And so 78% is very important. We have homeowners who are going in. We had one man to go in to a house that was valued at $45,000, and his loan amount was $24,000. And so that's wealth. He could borrow, and I tell him not to, but he could borrow against his house if he had a family emergency. And that's not true for most families. And that's not just among African Americans. That's just not true for Americans in general. We have a lot of debt. And so our average home value is $50,000, but we've seen them as high as in Fraser area. They're seeing some growth at $83,000 with a $50,000 loan. And so they are going in homes at 62% loan to value. The average total mortgage payment, and that's PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, is $384 a month. So that's much cheaper than rent. And where we've made our loans, 40% have been in South Memphis, 52% have been in Fraser, and Orange Mound and the Heights are the balance, and we hope to expand to those other zip codes more. When there are opportunities, we're encouraging people to come in and visit us and see if they can get our loan product. And then I look at the delinquency rates. So we are the lender who is going to call you 6 months down the line. We may send you a gift card and say it's time to change your filter. No lender is going to do that but us. Or we talk about maintaining your home. And I always tell homeowners that you are now a part of an army in this neighborhood that's been distressed. So what your neighbor house looks like, what the park looks like in your neighborhood is important because it causes your value to go down if there's vacancy and blight. So now you join with us and you fight blight and vacancy and delinquencies in your neighborhood. You go to your local government agencies and you have better public spaces. And so they become advocates so that they are gaining wealth in home ownership. And I have to go back and say how we, and that's how to get in touch with us, how we funded this. The initial funding for this loan fund was through our state housing finance agency, THDA, Tennessee Housing Development Agency, has a pool of funds under the Community Investment Tax Credit. So in Tennessee, corporations are subjected to franchise and excise tax. This is not the federal business tax. And banks have to pay that too. And so they look at their budgets every year and determine how much franchise and excise tax they're going to have to pay based on their assets. And they can go to HGA to get money under the Community Investment Tax Credit. And then they can lend that money out to affordable housing developers or lenders, or they could use it themselves. And it's the loan amount, the interest rate for the loan is prime minus 4. So if prime is 3, it's a negative interest rate. So basically is 0. And so I get to borrow this money at effectively 0% over a 7-year amortization, and we'll come to some of hopefully they'll just give it to me at the end of the 7 years. And then I get to lend it out at low interest rates to the borrowers. And so our average interest rate keeps up with prime. We don't have anyone in our office that's looking at the London Interbank offering rate every day because we don't have that much staff, and I'm not going to do that. But I try to look at where prime is. And so we're about at 4%. Because if it goes up, we would have to pay the bank some interest rate. So if prime goes up to 5, we would pay 1%. So it's the difference. And so I'll open it up now, and I will stop talking because they keep putting those signs up.
Thank you so much, Rashawn and Morgan, for your very informative presentations. Thank you so much. At this time, we'd like to open the floor for questions. We're very short on time, and I'm also going to distribute the evaluation forms. Let me try to make my way back to you all. The lady in the back first. You can speak in the mic.
I'm going to. I just want to know, are we going to get a copy of these PowerPoints?
Yes, I hope so. I'll be happy to make the PowerPoint available. We can figure out how the conference is making that available. Make sure that happens.
Right, and we can work in partnership with them to make sure that happens for you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I am a realtor, and I've worked with the Works, and I think it's a great program. But as a realtor, what I'm finding, especially in trying to find my clients' homes at $50,000, that you run into most of those homes that are available on the market or renters in there, and they have lease agreements, okay? Now, my question is this. In the Blythe areas, you see homes that don't meet the standard. So, do you have a product that's equal to something like a 203K product? I think as far as helping those neighborhoods, that's going to be one of the areas to me that has to be improved, or maybe information about it available to realtors.
Thank you.
So as a fake lender, we don't have to go through a lot of rigmarole. I think Gary and I are the committee, and so we have been working with you and other realtors. We've discovered that we probably need to address that through something similar to HUD's or FHA's 203K program. Basically, it's a kind of an acquisition rehab loan. So you're buying and fixing up in the same loan amount. It's kind of a, I guess, ACT-PERM loan. And so we are looking into that, but we're always looking for more money to put in our pool. I didn't mention that we started with $700,000 from Pinnacle, quickly ran out of that. Well, I started with $500,000, and I had to sit outside of Pinnacle one day because I needed to close 4 loans, and I threatened them. And they were like, "Where are you?" I was like, "I'm outside the branch. Do you have the money wired into my account?" So they did wire it. I have to give them that. They wired $200,000 because I needed to close 4 loans. That was just how I got that loan agreement, by intimidation. And then we had a philanthropic source to put in another 1.7 million. And we also have down payment assistance. So we don't want our customers having to, and that's a grant. It's just recoverable if they try to sell or refinance the house. But there's no monthly payment on the down payment portion to help them cover the closing costs, the legal fees associated with buying a house.
All right, are there any additional questions? I'm coming with the microphone. I'm coming.
Hi. I have a question about the money that you say you get. I understand that the rates are very low. That's a competitive rate of 4%, but still for a person who's struggling financially, that 4% could be high, compared to a 2%. Every bit of savings is important. I was reading an article about this $732 million reserve fund for poor families, poor struggling families that, I'm sorry. I'm reading about this $732 million that the state of Tennessee had with DHS to help. I'm sorry, I was reading about this article online through the Commercial Appeal about this $732 million reserve that I think DHS or THS has kept and have not put to use. This money is strictly reserved for poor working families. So if you have access to some of that money that's been sitting there just accumulating for years, then you could even lower those interest rates or make other services available to these working poor families that need home assistance. Have you looked into getting access to those funds?
I haven't, but I did see that article also. We probably won't lower the interest rate. If you looked at the payment, it's about less than $400 a month. And so in order for us to be able to gain some interest to make more loans, we probably can't go down to a 2% rate. I don't think a lender in the residential market can go that low. Sometimes you'll see 3, a little over 3, but that's a shorter mortgage term, a 15-year mortgage. And so we still want to keep them in low payments, and so under $500 for home ownership. I did see the article, and I thought that would be a great idea because it's looking at that whole budget, and the Department of Human Services is looking at the SNAP benefits and sort of and providing assistance for families, very low-income families. And so I don't know if what the governor's office is going to do with that, but that's an opportunity for us to advocate to set aside a portion of those funds for lending in residential mortgages.
Thank you, and I apologize. That's all the time we have for questions at this time. I'm going to allow Rashawn and Morgan to close with some closing statements if they like. Very brief closing statements if you like.
Well, very briefly.
Very brief.
We'll make the presentation materials available. I would just note that if there are concerns that you have about particular institutions engaged in redlining practices, please look to our office as a resource. We'd love to work with you to help to sort through these materials and use them to your advocacy purposes. And again, if you are interested in being a tester or a mystery shopper, getting trained and receiving a stipend to do that, we'd love to work with you.
I didn't really have any closing statements, but we need to advocate on behalf of the most vulnerable families who need access to quality, affordable housing.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we hope the conversation continues past today. You can return your evaluation forms to me.